Morning, everyone. This is Russell Rucker. I'm here for another constitutional talk. And I thought today we go back into the convention that we've talked about before and proceed into the first few weeks. And once they had gathered and they placed the Pinckney and the Virginia plan together, the big dispute was over representation, whether we were going to have one branch or two branches was the primary concern initially. And then, how do we represent ourselves? Are we going to represent ourselves by population, or are we going to represent ourselves by property or wealth? And this really was a divisive situation. So, the old Articles of Confederation, each state had one vote, so there was that too. And it wasn't long, and we had decided, the delegates had decided that to have two branches, and in the first branch, it would be by population. But especially down in the South, they were complaining that we should be going by wealth. And by wealth, they meant counting the slaves. And they wanted the slaves counted as three-fifths of the man for a purpose of taxation and representation, because they wanted to increase their numbers. Especially in like Georgia, there wasn't a great amount of population yet. So they were trying to increase their numbers. But some of the debates in the convention welled around, well, okay, we can count the slaves as three-fifths and we could determine that as wealth. But what about up north? Are we going to count the cattle, the sheeps, and all that? And the big thing here was the northern states believed they were people, not property, and you can't be both people and property at the same time. So if you were to have an election, the black population, the slaves, could not vote. And so they were saying that they weren't people for basis of voting, but still they wanted representation for them. And so this was the big controversy, and eventually we delved into a great compromise. But when you get into the mid June and start discussing June itself and the complaints of the Virginia plan, Randolph of Virginia was pushing the Virginia plan, and Patterson of New Jersey came up with his own plan. Now, the differences really in these plans, and I do cover them in my book, 126 Days in Philadelphia, and we go through the arguments, and it's really a very good book for understanding our convention. Now, news the thing about Patterson's plan and Pinckney's plan was they stayed with the old Articles of Confederation. They were not changing the Articles of Confederation, they were kind of adding to it. So the whole idea of the convention too was just to add to the Articles of Confederation. But of course, Madison had his own plan, and he wanted more of a national government rather than a federal government. And in the end, we got kind of a hybrid. We got part national and part federal. Even today, it's referred to as the federal government, not generally as the national government, although it is stated sometimes as both, but it is a federal government. So we get to 4 or 5 weeks of arguing over how we're going to represent ourselves. And that's when Franklin brings up that we need to open our meetings with prayer and get some help from divine providence. And eventually we created a committee and I believe it was a committee of 11, one from each state that was represented there. You see, a couple of states weren't there. Rhode Island didn't send delegates, and New Jersey was late in arriving. So for a long time, we only had the 11 states represented in the convention. And this is kind of an important point to understand. So we're dealing with 11 states. So a lot of times you would have these ties. You'd have 5-4, 5 against, and you'd have one state that could not vote because they were tied in their caucus. So this would happen quite frequently. So we get into the New Jersey plan, and immediately Hamilton takes the floor and says how he doesn't like any of them. So he holds the floor all day and tells them exactly what he's looking for in a new document. But it's not really a formal plan. Some people refer to it as a Hamilton plan, but it is not. And I know on previous videos we covered all these different plans. Okay, coming out of the Grand Compromise and coming out of the Committee of 11, they bring forth this Grand Compromise where we'll have not one branch, but two branches of government, two branches in the legislature. One would be by population, and one would be by state. Now, the argument about wealth was, and what eventually won out was, population was wealth. That was the general consensus towards the end of the convention. But this would come up throughout the entire convention because they kept revisiting it, trying to worm away and get wealth involved into it, and trying not to offend the southern states because we didn't want them splitting away from the Union and wind up with maybe 2 or even 3 countries in the Union, and two or three countries not really in the Union, but in separate unions. And then the possibility of armed conflict to unite the group. So they were trying to avoid the sword. And they gave, in the Grand Compromise, they gave the House of Representatives by population, and they gave them the power of the purse. And a lot of our delegates didn't think that was any great thing, and others did. So they were disputing that as well. But they gave them the power of the purse, along with a lot of other powers throughout what became Article 1 of our Constitution. And you gave different powers to the Senate, such as that of approving treaties, um, um, advise and consent of nominations and judges and things like that. There were a lot of people that wanted the Senate to be more like the House of Lords. And there were those that didn't even want to pay people in the Senate because they wanted the wealthiest men in the Senate. And they wanted the more like a House of Commons or more of a common group of people in the House. So that you would have to go through both branches to have any law passed. And this was all part of the Grand Compromise, where we would have one by population, the other by states, and then there were also discussions on who elected the Senate. You see, a lot of people wanted popular vote. A lot of people wanted states to elect it, and then a lot of people wanted the Senate to elect the presidency, either as we worked through the convention and to achieve the document we have today. So there's really a lot at stake in the convention, and this grand compromise is very important to how we finally got Constitution through. So I would like you to kind of think of all the different methods and ways here and how we finally decided on getting the legislature set up. And I think next time we get into the Constitutional Convention, we'll probably be talking about Franklin's desire for prayer and the religious liberty that is in the original document as well. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll catch you next time on the next Constitutional Talks. Bye for now, folks.